Welcome to Hey Listen, where we discuss faith, leadership, and the mission of the church. We're so glad you've joined us. Now to today's episode. All right, we're ready for another episode, and I am really pumped for this one. I'm a kids minister, so I love all things kid-friendly, but today threw me for a curveball. The gospel according to Winnie the Pooh. So let's jump right in to where you're going with this one.
I would think that most people would think this was your idea,
right?
So
it was not.
This was my idea. And I have to say up front, I'm a huge fan. I think that Winnie the Pooh is my spirit animal. And so I just have always enjoyed it from the time I was a kid. That the stories are really sweet. And as my kids grew up, and you see that one of the themes is your kids growing up and that imagination kind of waning.
Yeah.
So I look at it totally different now. It kind of makes me sad.
Sure.
In some ways, but there are incredible truths that we can mine from a story like this. And another reason that it's a good time to do this is Winnie the Pooh turns 100 years old next year.
Okay.
So
Wow.
actually, it's in December of this year was the first time that this came out in a paper. I forget which one. It's like Punch or something silly like that in England. And then it was published in 1926. And so this was a Cambridge educated man who wrote this, A.A. Milne. And he was a sharp guy. He wrote plays and poems and everything.
Okay.
And so this was a little bit out of his comfort zone, but it's what his legacy became.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. And we want to say up front, these stories were not written to be Christian stories.
Right.
So we're not, when we talk about the gospel according to Winnie the Pooh, it's all with a grain of salt. We understand that that wasn't the purpose of this. But what's interesting, and we'll be talking about this in some of the episodes, is that there's a couple guys out there that have taken Winnie the Pooh and turned him into a Taoist. So clearly, Winnie the Pooh has a lot of range. You can kind of read into him different things. But Kayla, when you're talking with your kids, your kids are going to watch the Disney Channel or see a Disney movie from time to time, and those aren't necessarily intended to be Christian stories. But there are many times we can look, say Lion King or something like that, and you can see those stories about redemption and things. And so that may not be the main idea, but when we're wise as parents, just as Christians, when we're having conversations with people, taking good stories and using those stories to illustrate biblical truth, I think is a powerful witnessing tool.
Absolutely. And even just being able to talk after a show or a movie and say, what did you notice from that? What stood out to you that is not true or whatever it is, but being able to have that conversation so that they're hopefully training their little brains to be looking for those things.
Absolutely. And Jesus, as we're going to say in a little while, I mean, when he taught in stories, and he was using visual images and things that connected with people in real basic ways. And so good stories do that for us. And they all, any good story usually has something in it. It's good because it reminds us of something eternal. And so we'll be talking about that. So a couple things about Winnie the Pooh. Let's go ahead and throw some facts out there. So this was written for AA's son, so Christopher Robin. So his son's name was Christopher Robin. There's a museum in New York, I just found out this week, where you can go and see some of the toys that Christopher Robin played with. And there's a bear and there's some of the other animals. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then, here's a guy, and he's just trying to sort of entertain his son. And they had gone to the London Zoo, and there was a Canadian black bear there called Winnipeg. And so that was sort of the beginning of the idea of a talking bear. And little Christopher Robin Milne, he was excited about the bear. That was his favorite animal. And thus, Winnie the Pooh was born. What's interesting is that he wasn't called Winnie the Pooh at first.
Okay.
It was Edward Bear.
Edward Bear. What a change if they would have stuck with that.
Yeah,
That does not carry the same way.
I don't think we would be talking about this if it was Edward Bear.
Probably not.
It just shows you that things change and sometimes for the better. And so there we go. And so that's basically the story. And later in life, AA really just kind of despised it all because it brought too much attention to his family. There's a side to this story that is quite interesting in that way. But as we start this conversation again, let's just frame this biblically. when we go back to the Old Testament and we see what the Israelites experienced in Egypt, as they were leaving Egypt, there's this amazing story from Exodus 12:36, where right as they were leaving, the Egyptians gave them all their gold and silver. And some have called that the spoil of the Egyptians. In fact, the text actually uses that phrase. And I've always felt like that one of the reasons why we need to read stories outside of just the Christian context is because human beings, generally speaking, are looking for truth. Sometimes they don't land in the right place, but it is helpful for us as Christians to see those journeys people are taking, and especially those journeys where they don't end up in a good place, because sometimes that can help us get over a hump in our lives or help someone else. But I want us to kind of approach this conversation, and again, so we don't get a bunch of angry emails about, watering down the gospel. That's not the point. The point is, we believe that there are some things out there that we can talk about that weren't necessarily intended to be Christian. And Milne was not a believer. I read a few of his poems, and it seems like he's a end of the era Victorian in the sense that he doesn't mind in his poetry writing about God, but there's a very real sense that he doesn't believe in God.
Okay.
And he was a World War I veteran, and that's really common for people of this era to have had Christian foundations. So I think the reason why we're having this conversation is there are Christian foundations in this to some degree, but because of his experiences in the Great War, World War I, and even in World War II, he did serve as in England as some kind of chaplain, or not chaplain, but he served on the home front, so to speak.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot to this story. There's a lot of depth, and what you'll notice when you read Winnie the Pooh is that this is a great mind. Like he makes Pooh sound really like silly and dumb, but it's really
thought out.
It's well thought out.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump into a question with this. Pooh is a character known for simplicity and contentment, but how can his childlike simplicity reflect the kind of faith that Jesus calls us to? And I love this because I often say I'm in kids ministry for a reason. Not that I would hope I have a lot more depth than just surface level kids ministry, but I love that we can look at the simplicity of the gospel, of true stories from the Bible, and bring it to life for kids. So what does this look like according to Winnie the Pooh?
Yeah, I think this is another reason why I love Winnie the Pooh and just a lot of children's stories in general, is because as a pastor, when I face the crowd at Ridgecrest every Sunday, there's little ones out there, and there's PhDs and people that are very accomplished businessmen and women, and people who have life experiences well beyond me. The preaching of the word's an interesting thing because it has to kind of cover the gamut, where the people who need some intellectual stimuli, they can get that. But then look at Jesus. He really, that's not his main audience. Most of the time, his message is very simple and clear, attainable, right? And so when we come to Winnie the Pooh, what we realize here is one of the genius ideas here is that he covers important themes, but he does so from a perspective that a little kid can fully appreciate. And so that's what I love about our faith in Jesus, is that it doesn't require advanced philosophical or theological knowledge. The gospel is a truth for all people of all levels of education. And it really, every culture, the gospel story is not a culturally specific message. And I think a lot of people who weren't raised in church assume that the Christian message is kind of like a European white, construct. And that's absolutely not true. It comes from a totally different world, but it also, it just fits the world. It's good in every age and in every culture. And so when we find a great story like Winnie the Pooh, and we find a great character, so he's, the story is great, but it's great because it has this amazing character who's very simple. So let me give you a line from Winnie the Pooh. I think it's hilarious. Winnie the Pooh says this. He says, "It's more fun to talk with someone who doesn't use long, difficult words, but rather sort of easy words like, what about lunch?" Now, I put that quote down because Jeremy Muniz, Dr. Muniz, I always get accused, right, of using the big words.
Sure.
And that's kind of my thing. So I said Winnie the Pooh is my spirit animal. This is an aspirational goal. Okay. I'm not there.
Okay. I was a little surprised by that when you said that earlier.
Yeah. I love the quote because I know that this is something that we as preachers need to do a better job. So a lot of pastors like me have been blessed with a theological background and education. The problem is that that's not the people that we're trying to reach. And Winnie the Pooh, for me, is a corrective to say that we may have to go a little more complex than lunch, although lunch is wonderful. We just got through lunch. But it does show that sometimes we get lost in verbiage. Christians in particular that have been in the church all their lives don't even realize that some of the key language they use in their witnessing is church language.
Absolutely.
It's not simple.
Right. Just a couple weeks ago, we were able to train some preteens who are getting ready to go on mission trip. We did a whole lesson that afternoon on churchy words because even these preteens, these 5th and 6th graders, they're using things like asking Jesus into your heart or even just saved. What does that mean? Yeah. And so we went through a whole list of these churchy words so that we are using words that they can connect with because they're going to be teaching kindergarten through 6th grade in backyard Bible clubs. And we want them to use words that you can understand as a non-believer.
Yeah, I think that in our culture today really does. I hear it all the time. And I think I believe it's more and more true all the time and listening to people. They're not really listening for eloquence anymore. I think there was a time when preachers needed to think about being eloquent. That was in preaching classes. That kind of thought was there. I think that's a mistake today. I think that sounding intelligent, isn't a bad thing. But if that's your main goal, it has a certain woodenness to it, right?
Sure.
It's plastic.
Sure.
And there's this great book. It's just a history book. The scholar put together this thing called Daily Life in Ancient Rome. Carpania, I think is his name. And here, a great quote. He says, "Nothing is more exhausting in any language than continuous eloquence." That's a pretty fancy sentence there, but Winnie the Pooh would agree that it's just exhausting when someone is just berating you with big words instead of just telling you what you need to hear.
Sure.
So that's a big deal. And again, let's go back and let's think about Jesus. There's no doubt scholars, when they look at Jesus's teachings, they see immeasurable depth. This is the Son of God. And yet the immeasurable depth is it's kind of like swimming pools today that have those zero entry, right? For our kids. You can just kind of ease in an inch at a time.
Yeah.
Those parables have inch deep meaning. And then the next thing you know, you're in the deep end.
Sure.
As you grow and understand what Jesus is saying. When I was a kid, you just had to jump in, right? You jump in at 3 feet. That was the smallest that they had. And now, we ease in. And I think that that's what Jesus is teaching us as we're teaching children's lessons and really for preachers too.
Sure.
That a sermon or a lesson, it can start in that zero depth, right? And just gently go there. And so Winnie the Pooh, I think, does a really good job of reminding us of that.
Yeah. So a little bit of my testimony in a quick nutshell. I was saved when I was 7 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor with my mom. When I was 15, I really started to question if that salvation decision was real. Did I really understand what I was doing? And I went through this season where, looking back now, I would say I rededicated my life. But I felt like in that moment, that's actually when I was saved. And then another 5 or 6 years later, as I was studying kids ministry and really looking at my faith and really leaning on the Lord, He really showed me that, no, I was saved at 7. Wow. And I knew what I needed to know. And I think that's so important for parents. We want kids to be able to articulate their testimony. That's important to us. They don't have to have it all figured out.
Right.
And that is freeing as a parent, as a kids minister. We can share truths with them. They don't have to have it all figured out, though.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Winnie the Pooh is the hero of every story, but every episode, every adventure kind of starts with this almost cluelessness. But there's something about the simple mind. The simple mind is not clouded with all these big words and concepts. And there's a clarity in simplicity. So, when we say simple, we're not saying stupid, which is
right.
We're not supposed to use that word anyway, right?
Right.
It's a bad word, but that's not what we're talking about.
We're not watering anything down.
No.
Right.
And as you grow in your experiences in life, you'll meet people that do not have one single degree to their name, and yet they're clear thinkers. There's a simplicity to the thought that they're able to see through all of the jargon and mess of academia. And when we get into the specific characters in our next episode, that's what we'll talk about is, Milne was sort of showing us, he came from the most high level of academics. Cambridge is about as high as it gets. And yet the characters sort of show that that's not where the real smarts are, that's not where true wisdom can be found. And with Winnie the Pooh, you have this very simple mind who, in the end, because of his love for his friends, always seems to land on his feet, And so one thing I've noticed, and a guy wrote this book called The Tao of Pooh. So it's from I guess the guy's a Taoist, I don't know. And I read widely. I read comparative religions all the time. And so there was a season where I was I knew I was going to spend some time in Asia. So I really wanted to understand Taoist principles. Lao Tzu is the main, component of that. So I found, me being a Winnie the Pooh fan, I thought, I've got to read this. And I've let my kids listen to it. They think it's hilarious. But some of, I want you to know, like, Benjamin's wrong about some things. In fact, he talks about Puritans, and the guy completely doesn't understand the Puritan movement. So a big part of his book is just completely off base. So he's kind of a little hard on evangelicals. But he talks about how Winnie the Pooh, he compares him to the Chinese image of the uncarved block. So so let's just, in our minds, let's just visualize, if we had right in the middle of our table here just a block of wood. So we look at that block of wood and we know that it's just a block of wood. It really doesn't have any function, but we know it could be a lot of different things. So here's what's funny. The image of the uncarved block in Chinese, the word is Pooh.
Oh, interesting.
It literally is. And Hoff kind of laughs about that, but it is kind of interesting. But let's talk about this. Like, when we come to know Christ, we don't know who we are. I mean, we know who we are in the flesh, but God knows that we are something far more. And so if we think about coming to the Lord as the uncarved block and letting him have control of where we go, then we could be something quite beautiful. C.S. Lewis uses the analogy of the marble and the chisel. I think that's the same concept that we have here, and what we see with Winnie the Pooh is that he's simple and he's not forcing anything. His faith is in his friends, and in particular that Christopher Robin's going to come and save him if he gets himself in too much trouble. But there is that simplicity and that willingness to allow the world to happen around him, and him knowing that he can't control all of those things, but he's allowing things to sort of shape him as he goes. So I think that's good. I think kids are like that. We always say, our kids seem to be much more adaptable to change than we are. Right? And so Jesus said, unless you change and become like little children, Matthew 18:3, that's what Pooh represents, that childlike innocence that is able to move with the flow of life. And so I think that's kind of interesting about him.
Yeah, and I love it because these kids that we have opportunities to teach week in and week out, they see the simplicity of this, but there's so much more depth to them, and their questions they come up with, and the way they see things and think of things, they want to grow deep, and I love that. And I know that is somewhat just the culture of Ridgecrest because the families we have here, but I don't think we always give kids enough credit for how much they can take these truths of the gospel and expand on them.
Yeah, and I think that with our kids, you with your children, with my children, it just amazes us, doesn't it, how different they are.
Absolutely.
They not only looking different, but the behaviors and things of that nature. So with our families, when we're blessed and we have children, more than one child in particular, in this instance, we can sort of see that the work of God in creating each individual as they are in a beautiful way. And one of the things I've learned from reading Winnie the Pooh many times and thinking about, what's going on there is that, Winnie is able to just be who he is. He's not ashamed of that. He knows he's not the smartest bear in the forest, the smartest animal in the forest. He's okay with that. And Peter Scazzaro, the great, one of my greats anyway, in terms of emotional health and ministry, he says that a lot of leaders fail because they try to be someone that they are not.
Absolutely.
And when we are at our best is when we are who we are in Christ. And, I think that when we look at the other characters in the story, they're all anxious and nervous for different reasons. Pooh is not, because he knows who he is. And I think in discipleship, one of the things we can start with our kids and going on up to adults is telling people it's okay that you are who you are.
Yes.
Not the sin part.
Right.
That part, our brokenness is not okay. We're going to discover that through the word, through preaching, through prayer.
Right.
Get rid of that. But you're made in the image of God. And if you will allow him to shape you and break off those rough edges, then what you become is something quite wonderful.
Yes.
So we're not just talking about leadership. I think we're just talking about being a part of the kingdom of God.
Absolutely.
And this is how we embrace like who we are, but also something Christians are not doing a good job of today is embracing our limits. So with Winnie the Pooh again, he embraces his limits. He knows he can't write as well as Rabbit or have the wisdom of Owl. He just gives into that, and he's able to contribute and not worry about it.
Yes.
And so that's what when I say I want to be like Winnie, that's just it. I want to learn how to be more simple, not just in my vocabulary, but in my leadership style, to believe that God didn't make a mistake when he formed me and created me.
He equipped you
That's
for
right.
what you have ahead of you. Yeah. And even in my own kids, my 3 children learn very differently. And that can be a struggle. I have a couple of kids really close in age. And so there's always this kind of tension of competition, and they learn and have such different giftings. They're both amazing kids that learn very differently and have very different gifts. And so that tension, but helping them understand that it's okay to be you, to do that. And a couple of years ago, actually in a staff evaluation, I had some of the best advice in just kind of a hard season. But I was told, don't forget to continue being Miss Kayla.
There you go.
You don't have to, you don't have to be a big girl all the time. You can be Miss Kayla. Our orchestra director, Mr. Kelly, he tells me sometimes, oh, it's big girl Kayla today. And I think that's so funny because sometimes I like the head boppers and the sparkles and all the fun things. And then sometimes I come in, in a blazer and I'm like ready to go. And so I have very different looks, but I love that I have an opportunity to embrace who God made me to be and use those gifts in that way.
Well, one more thing, and we'll wrap up this segment. But I think that when we look at some of the sadness in our lives, it's because we're trying to force things and we're restless and we're not happy because we're not resting in Christ. And, contentment is so rare in the church today. Even in ministry, we're talking about this all the time. What are we after here? Are we trying to just get big for the sake of getting big? Of course you can say, well, the bigger the church, the more we can do missions. But really many times our motivations are much more based than that.
Right.
We're just restless. We're trying to find our identity in what we do instead of just who we are.
Sure.
And I know we keep saying it, but that's just what makes, to me, that's why I love Winnie the Pooh. He just has simple faith. And that's what I want for my heart. And I want it for the church as well. This ability to just rest in the Lord and know that who he created me to be, who he created Miss Kayla to be, what he's made Ridgecrest to be is unique and good. And the worst mistake we would make is to not embrace who he made us to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to keep this conversation going. And next episode, we're going to be talking more about the different characters and how we can relate to them. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Hey Listen.